Hi everyone. Welcome to our first roundtable, which is reimagining the city in the age of coronavirus, co-hosted by the Tishman Center, Tishman Environment and Design Center, and the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. My name is Emma Jane, and I'm an undergraduate environmental studies major at the New School, as well as an editor for Resilience. I'm going to be one of your hosts this evening, along with my friend SJ.
Hi, everyone. I'm SJ, a co-editor of Resilience Quarterly, a graduate from the New School with a degree in global studies, and your co-host tonight.
So just to give a little bit about us, Resilience is a quarterly publication co-produced by the Urban Systems Lab. We provide a unique forum to share strategies in design, data visualization, and interdisciplinary scholarship on urban ecology, environmental justice, and sustainable cities. I am so very excited to be introducing our panelists for the evening. First, we have Alan McGowan, who's an environmental studies lecturer at Eugene Lang College at the New School, as well as executive editor for Environment Magazine. We also have Timon McPherson, who is associate professor of urban ecology and director of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. Anna Fisiak is part-time faculty at Parsons School of Design Strategies at the New School, as well as principal of Anna Fisiak Consulting. Jimmy Pan is a design researcher, graphic artist, architect, and contributor to Resilience. And finally, Mike Harrington is assistant director at the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. We also have an artist in the audience who is Claudia Tomateo. She's going to be producing an artistic rendering of our roundtable today. Claudia is a research fellow at the Urban Systems Lab with a background in architecture and design. Resilience Quarterly is going to be publishing her work along with a recording or footage from the roundtable. For our audience members, if you have any questions throughout the roundtable, we are going to have time for audience questions at the end. If you would just submit your questions into the chat and specifically to myself, Emma Jane, I will be receiving them and then fielding them to ask a few of them to our panelists. And then for our panelists, just a reminder, it's awkward on Zoom, but as much as you can, try to just chime in whenever you want, discuss with each other, interrupt, whatever it is that people do in real life panels. And with that, we can begin our first question, which pertains to COVID. And that is, let me change my slide. How do you imagine the future of cities in the context of resilience to COVID-19 and climate change? Alan, you're my professor, so I get to choose you first.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with this very interesting and exciting panel. So these questions are tough questions because there are no easy answers to them. How do I imagine the future of cities? First of all, a little bit of a bias. I love cities. I think cities are great. I love the country. I love hiking in the country, but I think cities are my home. I love it because of the different people, the culture, and so forth. And by the way, they happen to be very sustainable. One's footprint in a city is much less than if you live in the country or even in the burbs. So the question sort of assumes to me that COVID and climate change are going to be here for a while, which I think is correct. Even though we have a vaccine, we're going to live with COVID and the after effects of having lived through it. I think we need to think through very carefully some of the lessons that we've learned from COVID, particularly the inequality which exists in our city and which we need to pay very careful attention to reducing, if not eliminating. Eliminating may be too bit of a stretch, but we certainly need to reduce it. And there are very simple things that we can do to reduce some of the inequality. For example, we could have internet access made available to every single person in the city. That would reduce some of the inequality that one finds in the school system, with some students not able to get internet unless they go to a hotspot, which sometimes is in a school bus. Climate change is also going to be with us and we need to figure out how to rebuild certain parts of the city. One of the things that COVID taught me anyway, in the very beginning, there were very few cars on the road. I live in the Upper West Side, and the streets were practically bare of cars. And the buses, therefore, could whip down the streets and get to places in real time. So just imagine what the future of Manhattan, let's say, just Manhattan, could be if we eliminated cars from the streets, and you could have a public transportation system with buses that really meant something. I'll stop there. I'm sure other people have other things to say.
Do any of the panelists want to respond to Alan?
Emma, how do you want to do this? Do you want to call on us? Do you want us to kind of jump in?
Yeah, I jump in whenever you would like. Feel free. I'm not going to call on you guys specifically unless so.
I just wasn't sure if you want to go through each question, you know, one by one or whatever. I'll let some others jump in. It's great. We'll pretend we're actually around a table.
Well, I can jump in. I don't know if and I totally agree with Alan. The Wi-Fi question is incredibly important, particularly because there's such a digital divide, and thinking that we're, you know, everything is online, including, you know, this panel, theater, school. So I think that is a really incredible question. I think for me, and it took me a really long time to think about this question because I don't know the answer. And it's kind of a really colossal question to answer. But for me, when I think about the future of cities, like I think of the things that get me really excited are the idea of like the Green New Deal and a care economy, because you're thinking about how we're reacting right now. There's so many different multi-layered crises that we're dealing with. So obviously COVID, obviously, you know, an economic crisis, the climate crisis. But on top of that, you know, we have to figure out a way to respond to people's immediate needs, basic needs, now and into the future. And I think we also have to recognize, you know, how we get to that future and who's at the table. And to do that, I think we have to recognize the toll of COVID, particularly on communities of color, EJ communities, frontline communities, and for me, the anxiety and grief that they're dealing with is like something that we really have to be conscious of, especially since communities like Rockaway are dealing with lingering PTSD from Sandy, not to mention other PTSDs. And it's important to understand the mental health implications. So I think that really affects who's at the table and who's helping us to build this future. And I'm really thinking about how do we get to this future? And I think it also requires to kind of slow down, because I feel like the crises are so colossal, existential. I think sometimes we have to, you know, this is a question that I've been kind of thinking about as a community-based planner. Is it ethical to plan right now? You know, how do we slow down planning? How do we make sure that everyone that should be at the table is at the table? And I think, you know, this mental health perspective is really important to helping people deal with some of these super existential crises. Yeah, and I think that, you know, thinking about how we can integrate mental health or peer mental health advocates into the work that we do as planners or architects or engineers, and thinking about how we can help meet people's basic need as we plan for the future. And recognize, I know, you know, this is Urban Systems Lab, where we all love nature, right? We're all here, you know, you have Timon's beautiful background, everyone has plants. So I think we all recognize the importance of green space, and there's a growing body of literature about the importance of green space and the positive effect it has on mental health outcomes, stress, cardiovascular disease. There's a new study just that came out in Lancet about green space and mortality. So it affects, our literally how long we live. So I think there's like the way that I see the future is us creating solutions that can address multiple complexities of people that are coming to the table and planning for the future, and trying to kind of meet them where they're at and help them get to that future. But I think it's really recognizing that, Alan mentioned, the incredible inequality that we're facing, and 20 million, I think it's 20 million women have exited the workforce. So really have to think through these issues of like who's at the table and how we're getting to that future and making sure everyone is there. And coming back to this connection to the importance of green space, we also recognize, frontline communities. And Mike Harrington, I hope you're going to talk about your work, but that green space is really important to heat island effect as infrastructure for climate change and against climate change to mitigate storm surge. So understanding and recognizing that the work and maintaining those spaces is work, and that we have to pay people for it. And currently it's done on a volunteer basis in a lot of ways. And so we have to recognize that we have to meet people's immediate need, economic need. So I'll stop there. I know I just kind of rambled, but.
I guess I could jump in since you mentioned some of the work that I do at the Tishman Center, and
Yeah.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and glad that I could be on this panel with you all. And to answer the question, I think that COVID and climate change are two large disasters, one more slow than the other. And I think that we've seen with COVID that we have the ability to marshal a lot of forces in a very short amount of time. And I think that in terms of solving problems, it shows that we haven't solved it, but like we can move toward a common purpose in solving problems in cities and basically at a global level. But when we look at the inequalities, we also can see that those are clear, and those are unfortunately very visceral. Like you can see like that people in frontline communities, and like for instance, Black people are dying at this disease, at COVID, at a much higher rate than white people, and so are Latino people. People of Latinx descent are as well. You can see it, like I've seen it in my own family. So it's something that is very present. And I think this is also, this is basically what's going to happen during with climate change as well. That's something that we have been seeing for a very long time, but it's sort of more slow and it's not publicized as much, and it's not invisible to the people that it's happening to. But a lot of people don't seem to recognize that these sorts of things happen. Like if you're talking about something like some of the work I've done with urban heat, the biggest predictor is your race, of if you'll die from urban heat, like your race and age. And it's also, funnily enough, one of the biggest predictors if you're going to die from COVID as well. So because a lot of the things that are attacking people, especially in those frontline and fence line communities, are issues that they've been dealing with decades in terms of like respiratory health, heart conditions, constant stress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are two things that I can imagine for cities. And I think that it shows that that cities have a lot of power, but they, and in terms of fighting climate change, cities have a lot of power, but cities basically can't do it themselves. So I think it's also showed a sort of vulnerability that we have in cities, that we do need to work within a much larger community. We do need to be able to work at multiple levels, municipal, federal, and local, to be able to shift things and make solutions for people. And like you said, Anna, to also make sure that we are getting buy-in from the people that this is affecting the most, because we have those solutions. We've been dealing with these issues for so long. But we're often not listened to. So I think we have an opportunity to help shape our cities, because cities are where a lot of minorities live, minorities live. So you know, this is where we live. This is where we've been, a lot of us, since coming or being brought to the country. So yeah, that's a couple of thoughts I had about that.
I can jump in to follow that. I first of all, you know, I see about 100 participants in here, so this is extremely exciting. I also thank you to all of the individuals who have gathered us here. I think that's an important, like the back end of making this happen. That's super important to you know, point out. The other preface before I try to answer this very overwhelmingly big question is that I think whatever I do say is always, you know, I'm still learning, and I think the knowledge at this present moment is, you know, kind of developed to a certain degree. So I'm open to anyone either pushing back against it, so that I can learn from, you know, what mistakes that I may be saying, or maybe what information that I'm looking at that I might be assessing incorrectly. And so I want to start pretty large. I mean, no, I want to start pretty specific and then zoom out to be pretty far out. And I want to cite this one. I mean, in my written, I guess, paper or document for resilience in the quarterly, I cite a study by Rebecca Hetty. I'm reading off of my other screen, so I make sure I don't get it wrong. Rebecca Hetty and Jennifer Eberhardt, and it's called "The Numbers Don't Speak for Themselves." And it talks about how when you're presented with maybe data or numbers describing a type of either inequality or something that may come to exist, like climate change, that maybe you're actually contributing to making the thought of that contributes to making that a reality and causing a greater acceptance of it. I mean, that's a very small portion of what the entire paper is about, what entire paper of theirs is about. But I think that's very important, is the important takeaway from that is to understand what determines those numbers, especially like how those numbers are chosen, who is who has power when tabulating those numbers, and why those numbers, like what questions that are asked and why they are asked to create that set of data. And I want to shift towards Georgia Lupi's work. She's I think a partner at Pentagram and a founder at Akarat. And she has this statement, which is, it's called "Visualize Uncertainty." And I've been thinking a lot about how we measure uncertainty, or a lot of the studies in climate change, or I mean, I don't think I have a great in-depth knowledge of all of these particular fields, but it's a lot of measurement of uncertainty or tabulating uncertainty. And I think visualizing uncertainty moves into a totally different way of operating and thinking, which I think everyone has the ability to visualize. And I think maybe that's, I hate to say common ground because that's a very weird term, but I'll say that for lack of a better word, but like some common ground where we can talk that's outside of the numbers and something that's much more personal, right? Personal as in, I may feel more vulnerable to climate change as the person that lives next to me. Like I'm originally from Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, and you know, I saw a little bit of the aftermath of Sandy, and what I may see in like a zone B is different than someone else who's in a zone A and someone else who's in a zone X, right? So the way that you each see vulnerability or even visualize vulnerability, like what visualize meaning, what do I need to do if I'm in danger? Like all of those things, and how we can build a future which is, again, equitable. I don't think I understand it fully myself, but I can say like that is the like a goal that's further out there. And I would want to try and answer this by saying how do I imagine the future of cities is that, and hopefully this makes sense, is how cities and their tethers, right? So I'm thinking about cities as an entity, but also the tethers to, or whatever people who commute to the cities, people who commute away from the cities due to whether it is because of COVID, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's trying to, like, the city is a living and breathing thing, but also has connections to other places. And I think, Mike and Anna both mentioned this as their points. And I want to maybe use that to land on this idea of, I don't think it's like the small things that we can do. Like, I'm thinking of me as a person. If someone asked me 5 years ago, hey, climate change is real, what can you do? I have no idea, to be honest. I don't, right? But so it has to be maybe a multi-scalar approach. And I think there needs to be more empowerment in maybe finding people who bridge, or, supporting, whether it is fiscally or whether it like I said, financially, or giving them the tools to bridge the gaps between local, regional, and global. And you think about it as supply chains, but not as like what supply chains can help these things exist, but like who and what understands that space of in between, and how do you empower those people? Space of in between being someone that's both regional and global, knows what the positives and the negatives, and being able to come and talk very personal to someone and say, I don't know, like I don't know how to solve this. And I might be wrong, but how do we continue, and what should we move forward? And I mean, how should we move forward? And I think my vision in the future, if we can say it as that, is definitely something that is small, like a conversation, developed into like something of a collective vision or dream. I know that's like super esoteric to end on, but I think that's where I would want to move towards.
I like that, Jimmy. Thanks. It's really nice to think about. And there's a couple of things you said that I definitely want to pick up on, but I had a whole list of things I wanted to say, and I swear Anna said like every single one of them. And so I don't even know if I should bother. I thought you did just such an excellent job. But I was going to start with something that Mike was raising about the overlapping impacts of disasters. And I think this is the thing that maybe some of you have been working on for a long time, the way Mike has, the way I have, or maybe it's kind of new, but it seems to me that the COVID has like torn off this sort of veil of you can ignore it, and it's extremely obvious the way in which, as Mike said, communities of color and low-income folks in all across cities, all across the world, and we see this really starkly in New York, experience disasters differently than everyone else, and are extremely impacted. And I think this is something that combines with hopefully, when you think about the future of cities, hopefully what this is driving is an awareness that allows us the ability to start to move towards the change that people have been asking for a long time, and that people have been screaming for a long time, but to create those kinds of processes. And Anna, you were mentioning the need for this to be procedurally done, for it to be recognized, for the processes themselves to be more open and transparent and inclusive, which I absolutely agree with. But I think that's one thing that's been happening, right? Is that COVID has elevated the awareness, and I hope I'm not overstating, because that's what I see, and that's what I see in the conversations around me. And if that's not fully true, then we need to make it true, that it's just abundantly clear that we can't accept this anymore. The other thing that seems to me extremely clear is that, and this is something you were getting at, Anna, the multi-hazard context we live in, that it was Sandy and then, and then it went away in New York City. Or if you were, and you have long memory for some people, but other people have very short memory if you weren't, dramatically affected. And there's other events, and they sort of come and they go. But I think we're starting to realize that all of us are living in a multi-hazard world, and that disasters are coming more frequently, more intensely, and there's many of them. And so when you put those two statements together, it's a multi-hazard world, and it's deeply unequal in terms of the disproportionate impacts. It multiplies. And so now we're seeing not only this overlapping of who's being affected, but they're being affected more intensely, more frequently, right? So in a sense, the urgency is sort of ramping up. And so when I think about the future of cities, I think about what people are talking about now, that these are becoming more obvious, that it's more clear, what, maybe not exactly what needs to be done, but that we have to actually shift the way we plan, or it has to shift the way we make policy, that the people at the table, as you were saying, Anna, have to be different people, because whatever we've been doing before hasn't protected us enough from the impacts of climate change driven extreme events, and it hasn't protected us enough from COVID. And so there's got to be something different there. And I think there are signs that you see, whether it's at the people getting around the table in local nonprofits and community organizations that are mobilizing and finding more resources because they're being made more available to mobilize that. Or you see it even in city agencies that are getting around the table and saying, all right, what's our rapid response team going to be? And you find them talking about engagement and equity and justice, and not about how we keep the subway running. It is about how to keep the subway running. It is about who needs to be, able to get on the subway and to be able to move around the city, but it's coming from a different perspective. And so to me, this is positive. It's not the change. It's the moments that are starting to raise some awareness to begin to change. And there's certain signals to me that are quite positive too, like recognizing that you can move quickly, that we can shut down streets, make them available for people, make them not for cars, and that we can do it in a few weeks' time. And all of a sudden, people can socially distance in a way that they weren't able to 2 weeks before, because there's more space. Our cities are extremely tight. They're super packed in. We've been squeezing out nature for decades and decades. And all of a sudden we realize that, no, we need it for our mental health. It's extremely clear that coping capacity and adapting capacity during a disaster means you need nature, even if it's just to take a walk and clear your head and de-stress for a few minutes. But it also means, that we can do things quickly, like close streets. Hopefully we can start to close those streets permanently and make, when getting to this point of what are future cities, make those cities for people and not for cars. People have been talking about this for a long time, but all of a sudden you see when the disaster happens that we can do it very quickly. As an example, I noticed in Australia in March, within a couple weeks, there's been ideas of telehealth for a while, right? Your ability to get health, online, and all of a sudden they sort of rolled this out really dramatically, an entire telehealth program across the healthcare industry. They mobilized millions of dollars for this, and I don't tend to think of Australia being like the progressive leader in the world, but I think this is one of those places where you see things that happened within just a matter of weeks. They created apps to connect people with the elderly who had trouble even understanding how to use telehealth, making that easier. And all of a sudden you had this massive uptick in people being able to access healthcare because you would use technology to make a rapid change because you had to. And so when I think of the future of cities, I think of us, whether it's through community-based planning, whether it's coming from city agencies or regional, even federal governments, in terms of decision-making. I'm saying this decision-making, understanding the complexity we're in more than we did before, understanding that we have to be dealing with multiple problems at the same time and not piecemeal and siloed, and understanding that we can move quickly, that we don't have to take years and decades to deliberate on something. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel and just go straight to it. And I'm not trying to oversimplify, because I tend to think about complex systems and lots of scales of interactions like you were talking about, Jimmy, and all these interdependencies between the way, say, something happens in a city and it's affecting rural communities, and things that are happening in rural communities are affecting the urban communities. But I do think that that if we can plug in and mobilize the knowledge that we have, and by that I mean a very broad idea of knowledge, with everybody's knowledge counting, that we can move much faster and we can start to address the urgency of the problem with urgent action.
Wow, thank you all so much. I want to move on to our next question, which is talking a bit about data. So Emma's going to share a screen. This is a quote from Jimmy Pan's piece that was submitted to the first or the inaugural issue of Resilience Quarterly. So I want to read the quote. Data by itself does not create inequality, but it can be co-opted to contribute to bias. While the COVID pandemic, racial injustice, and climate change are vastly different in material terms, they are all nonetheless afflicted by lethargic data, numbers without narrative. So I want to know, and Jimmy, you started to talk about this, what does an empathic and equitable approach to data mean to you? So Jimmy, are you willing to start us off on this one?
Yeah, totally. I can speak to it. I think for me, the thing that is maybe visually visceral, as like I can feel the weight of the situation or state of the world or whatever, was that New York Times front page article that had names of everybody, and there's no like pure context, but there you can see the weight because it's very, you know, it's communicated very well. I think that is a good first step to get maybe attention, but you know, there's a few of the media outlets have been collecting stories of maybe either survivors or like people who have passed. I think that's also very interesting. But somewhere, and this is also a question that I have, and I'm trying to work through it in my own work, is how do you not only remember a person for what they've done, but how they struggled? And so in order to maybe reassess the connections between things and systems and how we do stuff in general, but also very specific, like how can a government entity provide the right help to a community, I think it really needs to start with very basic questions that are maybe tied to mental health and tied to anxiety and how you feel to a certain, like how did you feel when you were going through your COVID symptoms? Not, you know, or how did you feel when your partner or family member had to go to the hospital? Honest about the feelings, because that's a very raw data that it could be not true, because it can be, you know, emotionally or it can feel heavier when you're tied to it, obviously. But I think it's that complex, I don't know how to solve, I can't put it into a chart type of data that needs to be looked at holistically being, okay, this is maybe 100 or 200 people, 50 of them don't believe it. There has to be that data as well. And then 50 of them are saying that their hospitals were not able to help the person that they love the most, and then see where they're from in that community, and then bring in this very big data heavy, GIS, all these other things, which then can tell you how things are connected, supply chains, local businesses. I think it's very difficult to, I've never taken an ethnography or anthropology related thing or like practice, but I've taken a course during my graduate studies, and the ideas of merging maybe urban planning and behavioral science and ethnography as a very long term. So like this idea about long-term planning, it's not really planning, but long-term embedding yourself into the emotions of people and understanding so that they don't feel like they can't talk to you. And I think that's a specific type of data as well. And I don't know what you would call it, if empathic data, if data itself can be inherently empathic, but I think the questions we ask can be.
Thank you, Jimmy. If anyone else wants to chime in, that would be great.
I think I've really enjoyed your piece, Jimmy, and you make so many important points and about data being nuanced, slower, more human and humane. And I think for me, the question is not only, how we represent the data, but also how the data is created. So, who poses the question, who participates in the research, how is the data collected, how is the data analyzed? I think, the methodologies are often really not transparent of how it's analyzed, and what is the data used for? And this is a particularly huge issue in, I think, climate change research, because I think often the data stays very much in academia, and it doesn't really trickle down to the grassroots or to community-based organization that really need that information because they're doing the work on the ground. So I think it's imperative for, and I guess I'm like I sing the same song, but I think it's really important for communities to be involved in the creation of that data, of that research. And I keep coming back. I kind of reread this open letter that was written by Eve Tuck in 2009. She is an incredible writer, an incredible speaker for Indigenous communities and marginalized communities. She's an associate professor at University of Toronto, but she talks about this idea of the letter is called Suspending Damages, a letter to communities. And she pulls apart this use of kind of damage-centered research, and I kind of apply that to like damage-centered data. And I confronted that a lot as both, working for a community-based organization and someone who had to write a lot of grants to fund the work. And I was confronted with this fact that I had to kind of tell the tale of the damage in the community to get the funding to be able to fix the problem. So it had an incredible impact on me because those narratives, that damage-centered narratives, have the reinforced and reinscribe a one-dimensional notion of marginalized communities as depleted, ruined, hopeless. And she goes on to say that this is centrally a flawed theory of change, and that we have to completely reinvent the way that we think about research. As researchers, we love theories of change, right? It defines when the start and end of a project is, who's the audience, who's the us, how we think things are known, who do we need to be, who needs to be convinced by this data, what is considered data, what constitutes evidence, how is a finding identified. And I think, that she lists a number of kind of questions, but at the center, it's like thinking about, I think that taking what you wrote in the piece and taking it one step further, like how can we have data or research that is generative and kind of inspire people to action. And she talks about this, which I wanted to read the quote, but I think I'm going to hold off and just share the piece after the roundtable. But she calls for a desire-centered research, which I think you're kind of getting to about this need for humane data, humane research. And just a short quote, but she said, desire-centered research can yield analysis that upends commonly held assumptions of responsibilities, cohesiveness, ignorance, paralysis within disposed and disenfranchised communities. Desires about longing about a present that is enriched by both the past and the future is integral to our humanness. And I think I've been thinking about this a lot because in a lot of the conversations I have about planning, there's a need for joy. And I think, that what we're facing are just so monumental that we need to find ways to organize people around what do they want to see and kind of support that with the research and the data. And that's kind of what I wanted, but I really enjoyed your piece. So thank you for writing it. And I'll share it at the end of the roundtable if anybody wants to read it.
I think this raises some really fundamental questions. We need many more people at the table where the data are being developed.
Yeah.
We need science. One of the reasons that I love what the Urban Systems Lab does is that it does science in the context of a lot of other people and organizations that are connected to the data collection. And therefore, there is a route from those data to action on the ground, because at the end of the day, that is what we're going to need to have is action on the ground. And the data is going to have to speak to those people who are carrying out that action. They have to believe it. They have to internalize it. They have to understand what it means. They have to understand what its impact is. I mean, I admit I'm trained as an engineer. I like numbers. So when I see the number of deaths in the United States, that means something to me. When I see the number of deaths per day, that means something to me. And I think it means something to a lot of people. But in the end, we have to connect the data that we are developing with the people from whom that is being developed. And that means paying attention to indigenous communities. That means paying attention to Black and brown communities so that they can participate in the process, so they begin to believe the results.
Can jump in and yeah, I agree a lot with what everyone else was saying, and especially in terms of working with communities that are on the ground to actually work with them. Like at the Tishman Center, we use the Hermes principles for democratic organizing. So we never go reaching out to any sort of community group or partner and say, we know how to research for you. We work together with them in developing that research. So like they're more like partners. It's more of an equal relationship. And I think like most of us on this panel, we have done research. And I know for myself, I prefer to use participatory action model for research. And I also, there's some people I know on this call who I've been talking about with looking at something similar like design, and basically taking a community led look at how we design things too. I think like design and research go hand in hand, where I think you need to put more power in the hands of people that live in these places and actually have them like work with them. If they're not formally trained researchers, show them how to do that research, show them how to carry it out, so that they can understand like, okay, this is why this data looks like this. This is why these numbers look like that. And I know that's sort of a small scale thing, but I think actually educating people and working with them to help them understand quantitative and qualitative data, how we get to that, how that, like who creates that, and how to interpret it, I think will be really powerful if we can actually have people understand like what these numbers mean. Because I know, I think like Jimmy said, if you look, and I've seen this in other sorts of research, like if a number gets too big for people, they just can't comprehend it. They're just like, oh, that's like, if you're like 3,000 people died yesterday, that's a lot of people. Like I don't even know how many died this week in the US, but like it's sort of abstract, but every single person is a tragedy. Like every single one of those is a tragedy. And it's not just that that person died. There are people that knew those people. So like you have all these cascading tragedies that happen from these numbers. So it's not just 3,000 people died. Like tens of thousands of people were affected at a very, very personal level every day. And that's hard for, I think that's very hard for any person to like think about every day. That's a very dark thing to think about. And I think that's actually something that if you work in the climate arena, that's something that you maybe think about a lot. And I think we're a bit more used to thinking about that and dealing with that and confronting that on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, basically my answer to that question about like data is like just training people, working with people, meeting people where they're at, like and basically helping make more people citizen scientists so that they are doing the research in their communities, they're contributing to that scholarship. And I think it's academia's role to basically take that scholarship seriously. Don't just say like, oh, this is cute, these people are doing this little project. Like, no, they're creating data that's important data that you probably likely can't get because you don't have those connections. So yeah, I think giving people in communities more access to that sort of training would make data more empathic, because the people generating it would be the people that are most affected by it.
Yeah, I think Mike, you said it so well, and it's one of the things not everyone else will know, but like our group, the Urban Systems Lab, and Mike's team at Tishman Environment Design Center, it's baby steps, right? But it's still trying to do some of this, coming together, providing trainings, saying, okay, apparently, everybody needs to be working some way with map-based data, right? And so can we do a little training on that? And provide just some simple, ways for people to kind of plug in and say, here are some methods for you to bring your own data into these kinds of formats, or for you to access other data, but now you have tools to use them. I think those are starting, but I agree with you 100%, Mike, that's a huge part of this. One is training people to be able to create their own analyses, do their own assessments, right? Bring their own data in and have some of the skills that tend to be sort of siloed in academia or in, more of a wealthy sector, and whether it's a business sector or others, right? So I think that's about democratizing tools, and training is key for that. The other piece, though, which a number of you have touched on, is sort of the listening and the inclusivity around the kinds of data that we consider of value. And so I don't need to repeat what's already been well said, but I think that's a really important piece there, this understanding that all information has value, all knowledge has value, and that hasn't been the case. That hasn't been considered the case, right? That there's some data are privileged, some data are considered data, and the rest is, I don't know, it's just ignored. And I think that's something that's a huge project within the research community, within academic community, that's beginning, but it has a huge way to go to really actually bring Indigenous knowledge into decision making, to actually bring on the ground community knowledge about what a good resilience strategy is into, say, a policy document, or into a plan, or into legislation. And there are, we could talk about some of the good examples of things where this is starting to happen. So again, I think there's places where progress is happening, but it's to some extent just the beginning. And the other piece that I think between this sort of elevating and including multiple forms of knowledge, and then training and skills and providing better access, is transparency in the data. And this is something that is, maybe we could talk some more about, but I think that's something that is massive as well, is lots of data being collected all the time and by lots of different sources, but they're not available to everyone. And so that's not just because maybe you don't have skills, that's because they're literally not available. Like, you can't get them. And so data transparency is pretty massive in terms of us understanding our own lives, understanding our own communities that are being collected and used for other kinds of purposes. And this is a pretty massive issue when you start to think about, especially in cities, the way in which they're monitored by so many kinds of tools out there, right? And there's a positive benefit to this, that there is more information, and we live in very complex systems. It's hard to understand what's going on without information. But you need multiple forms of information, and it needs to be transparent and available. And so I think this, to me, that's like the third piece in the middle here, is the need for transparency. And you see progress. Cities are starting to create open data platforms, right? And some of them are expanding, and now you've got hundreds, and now you have thousands of data sets. But there's more to do there. And the private sector now and then starting to open up some things in certain parts, but there's got to be much greater transparency in the private sector around data that we all need to be able to plan our communities and to do the kinds of on the ground work. So anyway, those are kind of the three pieces that I'm hearing we'll talk about, and then I think about quite a bit. And I think there are signals that on each of those fronts we're making some progress, but we have much more to do. And to some extent, this gets to the next question. It's like, what should we be working on? What can people be working on? How can you work on it in your community, or with your level of expertise, or in your organization? And data is one of these. And I think it's important to maybe not just call it data, but to really think about it as diverse knowledges. And sometimes switching the language is critical to giving value to what's there. And so, again, these are just some pieces of how maybe we can start making some progress where you're seeing the beginning, but we've got to do much more, and we're going to have to do it, I think, a little bit faster.
Timon, thank you so much. And that was a wonderful segue into our next question. And I am looking at the time, and I really want to make sure we have some room for audience questions at the end. So I'm going to shorten this last question just a little bit, but imagine this as this final question for you all. before we move into audience questions as like a communal visioning process. So that can mean that your responses are hyper-specific and place-based or dreamlike and visionary. So the question is, how do we build equitable and resilient cities post-COVID? And how can listeners of this roundtable participate within their communities? And just to note time, I'm going to ask you all, make it the question maybe a little harder, and identify only one thing that stands out most to you in your work, so that we can then move on to some audience questions, because I've heard that there are some good ones coming in. But Timon, since you started to talk a little bit about that, can you start us off?
Sure. So I actually think if I'm going to pick one, I'm going to pick this one, which is the question. I think the process of talking to communities, your community, bringing your skills, together with, as Mike was talking about, other communities, to ask people, what is your vision of a resilient future, is a fundamental part of actually achieving any vision. And so that's some of the work that we've been doing for a lot of years. And just give a sort of quick example. And we've done this work in a number of cities, including in New York, but in Puerto Rico, for example, in San Juan, before Hurricane Maria, we were down there asking this question at a small community level: what is your vision, and how can we bring around the table community activists, nonprofit organizations, other community leaders, together with FEMA, city agency officials, et cetera, and to ask this question: what is the collective community vision? And not to say it's consensus and everybody agrees, but actually to be starting that whole process. That's part of what I see as a critical part of the visioning, is to say we have to be doing this work, and we have to be doing this work everywhere, because it's part of a way to actually bring more inclusive voices into visioning processes. And what underlines it, and I think this could be a way of sort of even introducing this question, is if you don't have a vision of a better future, how are you going to get there? And so to even do the visioning work, like I'm sure others have some very specific things, like I want my cities to be green all over. I want green walls and green roofs and green parks, and I want them for everybody. But that's my vision. And I think the community visioning process is to some extent some of the most fundamental part of what a vision needs to be.
My answer to this question is political involvement. The streets need to talk. We need political action. We have an opportunity with a new administration coming in. That administration is not going to do much unless it gets pushed. And we need to do the pushing. And the thing that all of us can do is not only talk to our neighbor, not only talk to our coworker, not only talk to our boss, but get involved in political action. That is what is going to change and is going to make our city more livable.
I'll just piggyback on that, because I think that's what Timon and Alan said is right on. And I think we have to support and build power of marginalized communities, support candidates that are coming from those communities, support local CBOs and EJ organizations. But I think it's really organizing and organizing your community wherever you're part of, whether you're part of, a neighborhood network, whether you're part of a music scene, or whether you're part of an art scene, like organizing the people you have around candidates that support your vision, because I think we got to build political power. Otherwise, things are going to keep going the way that they have been. So you can, call for candidates that you support, but.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was thinking the same exact thing actually as both Anna and Alan, that we have to organize, we have to listen, and we have to make sure that we're helping people to empower themselves. For instance, I am in a very small book club. We're reading the book All We Can Save, and two of my friends are not climate or environment people at all, but I really wanted them to join because I thought it would be very important for them to join this conversation and to make it so that they are listened to. And a lot of them have realized, like, oh, we already do some of this stuff. My mother does this stuff. My mother saves bags that she's had from like the 80s. So like she's conserving, she's not using new plastics. So I think like letting people know that they have that power and organizing them and having them figure out how they can direct that power will like help us shape our cities. And if we get enough voices, because I know the voices are always trying to be silenced. There's so many ways to silence those voices, so we cannot allow ourselves to be shut up. And we have to make sure to like support each other and to listen to each other and move together. And I think that can only be done politically. And you don't even have to be a citizen of the United States to do some of that stuff. You can like knock on doors, you can talk to your neighbors. Voting is very, 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 very important, but it's not the only option that you have if you are not able to vote. Because so many people that should be able to vote don't have the franchise, and there's still stuff that we can do. So even if someone feels they can't do something, we have to find ways to get them involved and help them with the process and help them move together towards a more equitable future in our communities.
This is a difficult question. I think for me personally, I don't think I can say it better than all the answers that have been brought out, have been stated so far. I can echo in the, I guess, feeling in the same way about how to empower, but maybe I'll take a much farther reaching one, if I may, and you guys can tell me if this just is a way out of left field. I've been, I guess, thinking about, if anyone's familiar with the Sketchbook project, I think it developed a very long time ago, maybe in 2010, where you can send in your own sketchbooks or like, and they have a whole repository of it. And I take a lot of interest in Georgia Lupi's work, especially I think her year-long like logging of her days or something like that, and on postcards. And I'm just trying to imagine what maybe like a library or like books for every community that shows some sort of institutionalized knowledge that is different from the things that we connect, which are mainly built out of stories, and that it can show how a community has changed over time. So I think for me, maybe it's too big picture, but the idea of reflecting on the idea of reflection can't happen if you don't know the history of where you've come from, especially when let's say you move into a place and you don't know anybody, you don't, like, how do you get in touch with your neighbors? And I think maybe finding some sort of space that develops like a library of institutional knowledge of how, just like these stories of the people that have lived there, particularly like, let's say in Sandy and Sheepshead Bay for me, is something that I would like to do, and take that and see if there's any value that can change how policymaking is done. Even trying to find, I think it has to be multi-scalar, like whoever holds more power at the like governmental, political like scene, they have to also change the way they operate. But it's hard because you're in a political lock-in, right? You're stuck in these systems which give you the power. So like, how do you question the power? How do you question that system? I think maybe the most down to like practical thing is trying to find I found like groups of people, which like sometimes things that I'm afraid to do. And I try to find groups of people in my community that either are open to coming together and like either pursuing political like activism, or writing a book or submitting a piece, things of that nature, even a small thing. I think Timon had mentioned something of we can move quickly. I think finding things that we can move quickly through is definitely a future that we need to grasp upon.
Okay, amazing. Thank you all so much for that. And I appreciate your time effectiveness. That was very impressive. I have been receiving so many questions from the audience, so many amazing questions. We only have time for 2 at the moment. And audience members who've been sending in your questions, we're going to have the Urban Systems Lab email at the end of this where you can send more questions if you want to continue the conversation afterwards, because there are just so many amazing ones, but we don't have time for them all. So one question I would like to ask, and I'm going to ask, I think I'm going to ask Timon to start off with this one. And if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. But it is, how can we address the dire need to create educational programs in cities that not only inform students or children, but also inform society at large about the new and environmental health benefits of green cities, open spaces, parks, and the improvement it'll have on our immune system and other topics that this could benefit?
That's a super good question. And I'm just be super honest, I don't really know. I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists to help answer that question, because I think it's absolutely critical that we are, as we always say in like our undergraduate institutions, educating the next generation of leaders. But what I really mean is a mindset that has a value of the human connection to nature that can influence everything you think about the world. And I think there's something really worrisome about going from half of the human population to 70% of the human population living in cities where nature has been dramatically squeezed out. And so on this, one of the first things that you might see, and we see in all the information about it, is that, we don't get the benefits of nature, right? We don't have the same benefits from a health perspective, or we don't have the same benefits from the way in which nature could be cooling our cities. So we don't, have heat stroke and heat related mortality, morbidity. But underlying all of that to me is the human connection to the natural world, that I think is very difficult to get if you're growing up in a concrete jungle. And, again, you see issues of inequality and environmental injustice right there with the same pattern of less access to green space, less access to parks, lower quality parks, smaller places. And so I think the question is really about, how do you address the educational gap? And, if I'm just going to speak off the top of my head and not being someone who, feels like they have expertise in this area, I would say we've got to invest in our schools. And we've got to invest in schools and the neighborhoods that don't have the same levels of investments. We've got to do this at a national scale. We've got to do it at a city scale. And it's pretty dramatic. People talk about this all the time, but if you look at these big budgets in the federal government and you look at what's cut out of education or could be made available to education, I'm back on what Alan and Mike were saying in terms of we're going to have to get into the streets and demand this kind of investment. But I don't think it's just pay teachers more, build better facilities, provide more resources, give all the kids iPads. And I think it's also about bringing the nature into the schools. And again, there's some really amazing movements that have been happening in this school or that school or in this town, where community gardens have been invested for kids to be able to learn to grow their own food and to learn where it comes from, for kids to actually dig in the soil. And so some of this is about resources, but some of this is about investing in our communities. And I know I'm supposed to keep this short, but I'm going to tell a very quick story. When we started planting trees with new school students in the city about a decade ago, we planted thousands of them, and we did them with community groups. I remember being in the Bronx and a family and this young Black boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. We were teaching him how to plant a tree, and there was a worm in the hole. Like, he stuck a shovel in the hole, and we're digging out a hole, and he didn't know what a worm was, and never seen a worm. And so we had this whole amazing natural history moment of sort of this is a worm. This is what it does in the soil. This is why they're valuable. This is why you don't have to be afraid of them. You can hold it and you can put it back in, and this is good for the trees. But it also shocked me that it's possible to grow up in a world where you have never seen a worm, or never had the chance to plant a tree. And this is true. This is not an isolated incident. So we can tell stories like this, but they're not isolated incidents. So I think it's an absolutely critical question about what do we have to do to really invest in the education. And I think it's multi-pronged, but part of it is at this very community scale of bringing children into nature and helping them see that they're tightly connected to it: food, health, mental health, their livelihoods.
I totally agree with that. And I think the question goes to the heart of what it means to be a university. Higher education is facing a lot of issues, and it's on the cusp of some changes. I commend to you a book and an article by Michael Crow, head of Arizona State University, who has a vision of a university that is stimulating a quality education to a vastly larger group of people, both children, undergraduates, and adults. And I think the universities need to think through extremely carefully what is their role in educating all of society, because there are resources that every university has that can be put to that use.
And I'll jump in here just to sing the praises of some organizations that are doing this work really well. I think organizations like the Rockaway Initiative for Sustainability and Equity that are working with local youth are going into local schools to connect kids to their local environment, to the bay, to the ocean, to the dunes. So there are a lot of incredible organizations that are doing this work on the ground. And I think there's 2 points I want to make. This is a really critical time, especially with budget cuts. And we saw this over the summer that there were proposed cuts to the summer youth employment, which employs a lot of students that work at RISE, as well as working for the Parks Department, for a host of organizations that are able to pay students to go and do conservation work on the ground. So I think it's really critical for us to make sure that that funding stays, especially, the larger context around kind of city priorities and where we really should put funding. And I think this is a really critical time, particularly because, kids are outdoors right now. And there's this incredible article in the New York Times just showcasing some of this outdoor learning, and kids are learning better. They're able to connect to their local environment. And I think this, I think environment is everywhere. There's parks everywhere. There's weeds, Timon mentioned the worm, but we can connect to our own backyards and learn about natural history around, gain an appreciation of nature. So we don't have to leave the city to do that, which I know we're all kind of on the same page on that, but it's really critical to make sure the funding that is helping to support those organizations are in place, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of these programs. And I have to also admit, a lot of this work happens in the after school environment. So making sure that, we support those departments and that funding.
I'm going to jump in here just to ask another audience question, but that was amazing. Mike, I'm going to have you start off answering this one. The question is, city budgets have been and will be financially strapped for the immediate future as a result of COVID. In your ideal world, who would be at the table to promote economically feasible priorities?
Oh, that's thanks. That's a big question. And it also, the idea of the table, I was thinking about this in another book club I'm in, where someone was like, why do we even have a table? None of us are at a table right now. We probably won't be at a table for a very long time. And someone has to bring in that table, and we always ask, I always ask, whose table is this? And why do they get to choose who sits at this table? Why do we need a table at all? But to answer your question, I think we need to have more circles of people, or because I feel that table can put separation between you and other people. I think participatory budgeting is a really good way to deal with this, because you're actually putting the question to the people who are living in these conditions to to contribute more to their budgets. Like, I know that we have elected officials here that do a lot of that harder work, but I think we should let more people participate in budgeting and have a say in what happens where they live. And in some cases, maybe that slows things down, but for certain things, I think that's better if we take more of a slower approach at the beginning to make sure that we get things right. For certain things, like in terms of climate change, some things we do need to overhaul quite quickly. But I think participatory budgeting, especially at the city level, could make a big difference in that, and having more communities actually work towards creating the budgets where they live would be very helpful.
I think we have a little bit of time if anyone wants to jump in, or we can move to our final round questions. Cool. SJ,
Yes,
do you
participatory budgeting.
Oh.
Yes, that. More of that.
And
Yeah.
make it available for programming, not just capital.
Okay, this is a fun final question. So honestly, thank you all so much for being here. I want to close tonight's roundtable with a lightning round where you will all have only 1 to 2 words to answer this. So the question is, and I will give you an example. The question is, what are your hopes for 2021? And my hopes are ambitious optimism. And Emma, maybe to give the panelists a minute to think, what are your 2 words? What are your hopes for 2021?
My hopes for 2021 in 2 words would be, much like this roundtable, open discussion. Anyone can jump in to answer that, but no pressure. Take your time.
Political activism.
I'm going to quote someone. This is Bester, and he writes. He has a study, ethnographic study about Tsukuji, and he calls it inquisitive observation. I'm going to cheat and say another pair of second words. I'm going to say academia memes.
Veronica Olivato in the chat put caring leadership, and I really appreciate that one.
I would say people hugging.
I was going to say that. I was literally saying, what am I going to put with the word hug? It's got to be something with hug.
Right. Hugs all around.
But I was also thinking about leadership, and I was going to use the word empathic leadership, but caring is more straightforward. Let's just go with that.
I just have 1 word, which is Georgia.
Ah,
Georgia. Yeah.
Georgia in my
Yes,
mind.
yes.
In the chat, we have multi-species care from Chris Kennedy. Margaret Enlow said coronavirus vaccine or people hugging. Yep, to echo Mike there. And Kathleen said audacious compassion. Helen Santiago Fink says low carbon investments only. That's a few extra words, Helen. And then we also have from Mike Harrington, hugging safely, of course, thank you. Timon says deep decarbonization. Laura says fearless existence. Maggie says care infrastructure. Wow, thank you all so much for adding those to the chat.
I have to say,
Keep them coming. Keep putting them in there. Let's get a lot of those.
I feel a lot better knowing I'm not the only one who misses hugging, because I love hugging. I miss it so much.
It's hard to be a human and not connect this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad's been telling me how we're going to look back in 20 years and look back on videos of people handshaking and say, wow, what a vintage thing to do. And that's crazy to think about. I just want to hug people. But I guess I'll move into our farewells unless anyone has any last comments from our panelists. Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your precious day. I wanted to make the joke that if we were in person, I'm sure there would be thunderous applause happening right now. So for now, we'll just have silent Zoom applause. And also thank you to Claudia Tomateo, who's in the audience, and she's going to be doing an artistic rendering, which will be coming out soon. What else do I have? Oh yeah, and thank you also to the Tishman Environment Design Center for co-hosting with us. This has been amazing. And hold on, I have my list here. Yeah, oh, and let me share my screen. If you have any final questions, like I said, there were a lot of questions from the audience members. So if you have any more that you would like to send, I have the Urban Systems Lab email at the bottom here. And then we also have the Medium page for our publication Resilience, if you want to go check that out. Our call for submissions is coming out today, and it is Nature Cultures, Narratives of the City Beyond Human, and that'll be for our release in March. Yeah, we're so happy that we were able to do this. This has been fantastic. I hope to see you all in a roundtable again sometime soon. SJ, do you have any last words?
I'm just so grateful for you all to give us your Thursday evening, and really excited about this next issue of Resilience. Jimmy, I hope you contribute because you were in our first one. And thank you so much, everyone. Such a pleasure to be with you all.
Thanks, SJ. Thanks, Em and Jane. Awesome. You did an excellent job.
Great.
And thanks, everybody, for
Great
being
going,
here.
guys. Great going.
Thank you. This was so much
Very good.
fun.
Oh,
Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, it was
Be
great.
safe, everybody. Take care.
have a good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you all.
I learned a lot. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
Bye.